It is a tasty beverage. Okay. All right. Let's jump in. Like I said, we have lots to cover. So if you're here and you haven't said anything in the comments section, make sure you say hello. I want to hear from you. Say good morning. Let me know that you're alive and that you're here. It would be helpful for my energy, but also I love to be able to connect with each and one of you. So a little hello goes a long way. All right, so let's get started. This is your Grow Your Young Adult Ministry workshop. And this is what we're talking about today. We're going to talk about we're going to try to cover 3 areas of growing your young adult ministry. The first thing is step 1 is going to be discovery. And that's going to be about understanding your context. In discovery, we determine who you minister to and where you're ministering to them. Understanding ministry context leads to intentional ministry that accelerates growth and impact. The second thing we're going to talk about is a game plan, and we're going to give you a summarized version of a playbook. Now, we go through a significantly more detailed version of this whole webinar. In fact, this whole webinar is kind of a summary of a course that we do. But here you're going to see that you can build a playbook that you can use, that should say, to align with your church and the teams and volunteers around you, knowing where you're going and know how you're going to get there. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is foundations. We're going to talk about creating a sustainable structure. Plans move us forward, but structure holds us together. And so if we build a ministry structure that will create, we want to help you build a ministry structure that will create stability for growth and lasting impact. Okay, so this is a little graphic about most of the young adult leaders and the leaders I know who are maximizing their ministry. And it really comes down to a simple thing. Some leaders have plans and some leaders are winging it. I used to kind of wing it when I started ministering to young adults, but mostly because, and the reasons for that was because there weren't really good resources for me to find to help me not wing it. I just kind of took the challenge and the things I knew and I just went for it. And I know a lot of you are doing that and God's blessing that in some ways. And so I'm not poo-pooing it completely, but I do know that oftentimes when you're fully relying just on your skill and your talent and your charisma or whatever your innate skills are, it can lead to getting to a point and then getting stuck. And you get to a place where you lack momentum and you can't move the ministry forward after that. And so young adult ministry leaders who are maximizing their ministries, the ones that I know of, are also those who have clear ministry expectations and strategies that they use to see massive ministry growth. Spending our best energy working intentionally, and that's the world here. We want to work intentionally, builds patience and confidence. And one of the reasons some of you are discouraged as a young adult minister is that you're not sure where this thing is actually headed. And so unless there's immediate progress or immediate return, then you don't have the patience for the growth there. Whereas if you're working on a process and you have a plan in place, then you know already that there's going to be moments when you got to fire through it, but there's a bigger picture and a bigger thing that you're leaning for, and that helps you move forward and continue going and bring others with you. So you're in the right place if you no longer want to wing it as you're in a young adult ministry, or if you're just getting started, you don't want to wing it to just get started. You're also in the right place if you're launching, if this is you, if you're launching a young adult ministry from scratch, if you're looking to take your young adult ministry to the next level or have a heart for ministering to young adults. If you're a young adult pastor or minister serving in a church or parachurch, if you are a young adult ministry, if you're on a young adult ministry team, if you're a senior pastor who's trying to figure out what it would look like to jump into starting young adult ministry or ministering to young adults. And also you're in the right place if you're willing to invest time and energy to maximize your young adult ministry footprint. Now, stick around to the end. And hey, Angela, thanks for saying hello. Stick around to the end for some Q&A because we will try to make some time for that. So make sure we do that. Before we dive into the tactics, let me tell you a little bit about me and my own little young adult ministry story. Okay, so I'm going to read a lot of things on the screen here. And I know it's kind of silly to read on the screen, but I have a big story to tell with this, and this is really just the tip of the iceberg. But let's start. It says I received my call to ministry in 2011 while working in a career as a systems engineer. I'd been in an IT profession for close to 15 years before I began to feel a call to minister to young adults. I absolutely ran from the call. And I can't emphasize that. I actually ran from the call. It didn't make sense to me at all. I literally skipped the typical young adult phase of my life. I was married when I was 21, had 2 kids, and was buying a house by 23. I got straight into adulting, wasn't single for very long, and missed that whole phase. Okay, I'm supposed to just be reading and not adding living. So let me just read it. That meant, at least to me, that I was unqualified to minister to young adults, mostly because I didn't feel like I would be able to connect, because my life didn't look like most young adult lives looked at that time. So my prayers turned into arguments with God, and I was convinced I was not the guy for young adult ministry. But of course, a calling is just that, a calling. God would not leave me alone. So I started a young adult ministry group gathering in my apartment, and in my apartment at the time. And again, lots of life changes. And my passion to serve young adults grew exponentially. Agora, which is the name of my first young adult ministry happening in my apartment, helped me develop tools for young adult ministry. I later joined staff in 2012, but not as a young adult ministry guy, even though that's what I interviewed for. It was a very interesting situation. I was hired to handle connections, communications, and to serve as an assistant to the small groups pastor. We still kept our young adult ministry efforts going, but my staff role provided me well-rounded ministry experience that I'd use and need later. After 2 years, I heard God call me out of my staff role into the unknown of full-time young adult ministry, although he didn't tell me where. And that's the trick of the deal. He's just like, hey, go that way. I'm not going and I'll tell you when you arrive, when you get there. Anyway, so much more to the story. It was a complete step in the dark, but I distinctly remember God using the book of Judges and the story of Gideon, specifically the verse that says, go in the strength you have, as Gideon is arguing, saying he is not prepared to do what God was calling him to do. So I left the job and wandered into young adult ministry and found a small ministry called Elevate that was shared between two churches. I was fascinated. Long story short, I got connected and began pouring myself into Elevate. We transformed it from a small group ministry of about 25 people to an organized ministry with a full mission and vision. I devoured books, blogs, research surveys, and anything else I could get my hands on. Leadership, ministry, organization, time management, small groups, connections, marketing, preaching. It was all game. I was reading like a madman. Then we saw our biggest boost when we started implementing a clear plan of attack for ministry. We built teams and groups and built support structures for the ministry. As a result, we saw our impact continue to expand in our area. We had a mission statement called "We Empower Young Adults Toward Christian Leadership," and that carried us for the first at least 7 years, 5 to 7 years. I don't know. Time gets funky, especially with 2020. Anyway. So those were the best years of ministry we ever had. Our 10-year vision as an organization was always to both minister to young adults and support young adult ministries. As our ministry impact grew over the years, I started thinking about how to resource other ministries. I knew there weren't many resources available, so I kept track of our progress, projects, notes, and documents. At around 2020, God was clearly slowing down our momentum. Clearly slowing down our momentum, like everybody else. After a wedding palooza for 18 months, I swear we went to like 16 weddings in 18 months. It's not an exaggeration. I could probably give you names. And anyway, along with COVID and many other factors, we started to lean in on creating young adult ministry resources. That's where you come in. We want to see every church with a strategy to minister to young adults, but we know it can feel like a mapless journey. We're going to do something about that. All right, so here's a few folks from our Elevate history. I just want you guys to take a listen to, and then we'll come right back after this video.
Of young adults that I could do life with. And when I started, I've been coming to Elevate for 2 years. When I moved back to Texas, I was living in Georgia, and I moved back to Texas, and I knew that I needed to get involved in a community of young adults that I could do life with. And when I started looking at different young adult groups in the area, Elevate was the main one that I was able to find in Collin County. And I had a handful of friends that went there from my church and started coming. Yeah, I really enjoyed coming to Elevate. The first time I came, it was a place where I could connect. It was a place where, is a place where I can connect, a place where I was able to meet new friends and be with people that love Jesus like I did.
I have been coming to Elevate for right about 2 years now, actually. Coming up on 2 years in the summer. My experience with Elevate has been great. It's very community oriented, so I walked in, I'd been looking for a young adults group for a while, and so a huge part of that is, I think for all young adults, is like feeling welcomed and feeling wanted and noticed. Just like an acknowledgement that like, hey, I see you here, that's great. And so Elevate was never ever anything short of that. My first experience there it was awesome. People came up, they were friendly, and what I remember the most about it was that Antoine, our young adults pastor, he made sure that he came up and said like, hey, it's nice to meet you. And like, you know, his night was probably super busy, but he wanted to make sure that everyone felt welcomed. And then I also like that Elevate gives us a lot of opportunities to be a part of something big and to be to kind of move in our communities. So it's really cool that you know, it's for young adults, run by young adults, and kind of, you know, the purpose of Elevate is to empower young adults towards Christian leadership, and that's exactly what it is. It's you know, the leadership team is comprised of young adults who want to make a difference in Collin County, and so that really drew me to the group, to Elevate, just because I think that the young adult population and the college population can kind of be overlooked in some areas, and so yeah, I really like that about Elevate.
I've been going to Elevate since 2014, on and off. Well, I wasn't there when it began, but I was there when it was at the Cottonwood Creek Church, and we would meet, I guess in the lobby there were chairs everywhere, and we had a projector on the wall. It was much smaller, and then I stopped going for a while, and then I heard it moved to Chase Oaks, and that was pretty weird, just seeing new people. But what I love is that they kept the small groups after. They were doing that at Cottonwood, and it just carried over, so that was probably a really great, one of my favorite things, because you got to reflect over the message with other people. Elevate has always been a great place to go when you want to be in fellowship with others, like you want to feel comfortable, you want to feel at home. And what I've always loved about Elevate is every time I go, there's a new experience, just someone new that I meet, or a really cool conversation that I have with people. So I like going because it's a free place to go. Not financially wise, but you feel free, and everyone there is really open. And I've always enjoyed the people and how you can just tell that God is at work amongst everyone.
That's just a little bit of a video, and I love these three guys, Danny, Austin, and Sarah. They're my favorite people, but wanted to give you just a little snapshot of what the ministry did and how you know, how it affected people. And there's young adults like this who you can reach as well. And I can't wait to hear some of your stories. But we started as a small group. We had little to no funding. We had no formal training on young adult ministry, but we were passionate about getting it done. And I bet that's where a lot of you guys are. And we were also very under-resourced. So not only no funding, but we had minimal volunteers and shaky and inconsistent attendance. And all of that, that's where we started. And that's why I'm so passionate about sharing the techniques that grew our ministry in both quality and quantity. And let us take some of the pressure off your team by providing a framework that will launch or propel your young adult ministries forward. There's opportunities to serve young adults like this, like those like Austin and Danny and Sarah in your city and church. So give me a ready. I bet you guys have been ready, but give me a ready in the chat if you're ready to keep going. And I want you just to take a second and think about what it would look like a year from now if you had a really good strategy and really good progress in your ministry and just how that would feel. Take a second to think about that. Grab a notepad. And okay, we're going to get to it. We're going to get to the nitty gritty, the thing that you all came here for. So step number one is understanding your context. All right. So number one thing I need to tell you, and I wish I could say this over and over again, there is no silver bullet when it comes to young adult ministry. There's no silver bullet when it comes to young adult ministry. Listen, even though what we're gonna try to give you is some tools and some tips that will help you keep move forward and create a strategy, but you're gonna have to create the strategy based on your context, and that's the number one starting place. Is probably the biggest mistake most young adult ministry leaders make is they don't even think very much or for very long about their context. Each ministry will face its own unique challenges with its own unique demographics while serving in a unique local church culture. All right. And so context, and we're going to talk about that in this first section. Context is so key to ministry and ministering well. So the challenge before we jump in, right, before we get deeper into your context, some contextual considerations are relatively universal across all contexts. So that's a lot of words, context. But what we're saying there is before we get into your deal, there are some overriding ideas that everyone needs to begin to figure out. What we found is that a solid young adult ministry strategy or environment has quality answers to meeting these core desires of young adults across generations, meaning these are questions you're going to always be able to ask when it comes to young adult ministry, regardless of the context you're in. And you've got to be able to deal with the core desires of young adults to have a voice, right? So voice is to be heard or to have influence or to be understood, to be known, to be seen, to be recognized. You have the challenge of presence. They want to be seen, they want to be acknowledged, they want to be included. And then you have the challenge of opportunity. Young adults want to make their mark, they want to lead and to serve, and they want to fail and succeed. So these three things, voice, presence, and opportunity, form three initial hills that every young adult ministry, I think, and every church needs to begin to challenge. How will you give young adults voice? How will you show them their presence? How will you provide opportunities for them? So just remember that. Again, we would go way more into that in some of our more in-depth trainings, but it's important that you catch that because those are cross context, if you will. But the ministry challenge is that ministering is a context sport. If you've ever been on a ministry trip, you know what I mean. Effective ministry takes into account the environment in which the ministry is taking place. What is life like there? How does the gospel intersect their language and their culture and their stories? What are their biggest questions, doubts, and concerns? It is or would be foolish to go into a country armed with the gospel without a readiness and sensitivity for the local color and context of that city or country. Young adult ministry is not an exception to this core ministry principle. It's important that you start with discovery, that your first step is to understand your full context. And I know this is a little bit like stretching before running the race, right? It's a little bit like that. Like you feel like running the race is running the race, but the stretch is just as important as the run. And the discovery is just as important as the actual things you're probably thinking about when you think about ministry. Your first step is to understand your context. Paul did this extremely well. He wrote in 1 Corinthians, I've become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. But if you really think about it, Paul writes letters to the Corinthians about Corinthian issues. He writes the letters to Ephesus about Ephesian issues. He writes the letters to Philippians about things that are very specific to them in their context. First Peter is about a very specific context. Ministry happens in the arena of context, and understanding the context of those you're leading will help your ministry strategies going forward. So don't skip this step. You want to make sure that you start with discovery and ask yourself a series of questions. So here are the conditions of context, if you will. What is the context? Context is generational context. There's the local church context, and then there's the context at the individual level. Now we're gonna there's some words there on the screen there, but we're gonna keep going because we're gonna cover each one of these individually, and those same questions on this slide will show up later on. So here at the generational context, you ask yourself, what conversation are we in generationally? Now I give this story all the time. Is when I look at John chapter 3, right? John chapter 3 with Jesus's conversation with Nicodemus. He gives Nicodemus a really heady, kind of conversation, right? Nicodemus is a Pharisee. Jesus sort of tailors his conversation to Nicodemus as though he's talking to a Pharisee. They're talking about high level concepts. They're talking about, intellectual, on some levels, concepts. Jesus is giving him really interesting pictures for him to work through. And Nicodemus is a thinker, and he's being challenged by that, right? And so you see the Nicodemus conversation. Then in the next chapter, in John 4, we see Jesus meet the woman at the well. And the woman at the well's context is completely different. Her issue is a heart issue, and she's got a hole in her heart that she doesn't that she needs filled. And Jesus speaks to her in a different way than he spoke to Nicodemus. There's some same things. The concept about the gospel and who he is and how Jesus is the answer is the same, but how the conversation happens is significantly different. And it would be interesting, I would say it'd be silly if Jesus were to have a Nicodemus conversation with the woman at the well and a woman at the well conversation with Nicodemus. No, that wouldn't work very well at all. That Nicodemus, Jesus understood his audience there and spoke to them in his context, and the woman at the well with her context. So the question we have to ask from a generational level is, what conversation are we in? What conversation are we in? What are the questions that this generation is asking? What are the questions that they're struggling with, right? And how is it different than the generation we grew up in, or the generation before us that taught us, right? The questions that the generation is asking may be the same, it may be different. I would make the case that it is different. I won't get into my answers to this unless, again, for the sake of time, if we have time at the end, someone can ask the question and we can discuss it. But we should ask the question, what are the questions this generation is asking? And how can the gospel uniquely intercept this generation's doubts and fears? What are they? What are those doubts? What are the source of those doubts and fears? Understanding that will help us understand how to bring the gospel to those doubts. How does this generation feel about church and Christianity? How does this culture respond to church and Christianity? Again, generationally, this can be different. The culture is always moving and evolving and shifting. Actually, it's cyclical, right? It turns out that a lot of the things we do, we've seen before, but it's always moving. And we need to ask ourselves these questions. What traditions are useful, and where is creativity needed in order to minister? These are some preliminary things that you've got to figure out. Second thing is the local church context. Okay, so what is the context of your church? First was the context of the generation. Now, what's the context of your church? And these are, again, very important questions if you're in a local church context. What is the DNA of your church? In other words, what makes your church different, or what are the key cultural values that are exhibited in your church? And so I think beyond what's on the paper. A lot of times we write values in our churches, and that's not actually who we are. It's kind of who we want to be. But what are the actual DNA of your church? And you want to make sure that you consider that as you begin thinking about this young adult ministry thing. What does church leadership expect from your ministry? And that's really just about leadership alignment. You want to make sure that what you want out of the ministry is the same thing that they want out of the ministry. A lot of times this conversation doesn't even happen between young adult ministry leaders and their pastors. And for multiple reasons. Sometimes the pastors actually don't know what they want, or they do know what they want, and so it's important to actually have this conversation. What do we expect out of the ministry? What are the key identifiers to your church's culture? We talked about that. What are your agreed upon metrics of success? Not only is what is success, right? Understand what's being said there. Again, you're trying to get context for your local church and also your local leadership at your church. What do they want to see, and how will they measure that they're getting there? And is there an agreed upon metric of success, right? What are y'all going to be looking at? What are you going to be judged by? And that could be an ongoing conversation as you continue to learn and grow, but you certainly need to have that clear connection. Where is your church? Is it rural, urban, suburban, college town, non-college town? Like, all those things matter. How old is your church? What are the sacred cows in your church? These are all things, again, understanding the context, understanding where you're ministering and to whom you're ministering. These are all important questions to consider as you think through moving wisely and building a sustainable ministry inside of your church. The last thing is who are you ministering to? And you want to build a specific, I'm recommending in a longer form of this, we actually give you a sheet of paper where you want to write down a ministry profile, a young adult ministry profile. This is a very specific person. So I know that not all young adults are the same, and so this can feel a little counterintuitive. But really what you want to do is kind of niche down and think of 3 or 4, think about serving one young adult person and what their profile is, right? Who are they? What do they, what is their general age? And a lot of times you can combine this, right? You can set up 2 or 3 profiles and really get into almost creating a character. Like we had, when we were growing as a ministry, we had Elevate Eric and Elevate Erica. And nobody really knew about that. It was just only for myself and my co-leader. But every once in a while, when we thought about ideas or we thought about ministry, we would look and say, does this help Eric or Erica, right? Specifically, does it help them? Is this good? What would be a thing? Sometimes it's hard to think about young adult ministry when you think about 40 people or 50 people. But if you can get it down to 3 people and say, hey, these 3 people are kind of our ideal, if you will, ministry targets, then you can create a profile and constantly kind of look back at what you're doing to see if what you're doing is actually helping them. So what goes into a profile? Well, it's their average age. Where do they live? Meaning, do they live at home? Are they on their own? Are they on college dorms? Like where do they live? How do they live? Are they working? Are they going to school? What's fun to them? What's not fun to them? How do they connect to people? These are all questions. Where are your young adults internally and externally? So where do they meet is what that means to be, meaning where in the city are they? Where do those who don't go to your church meet up? Where do those who do go to your church meet up in your city? Where are those spots where you might find congregations, if you will, of young adults? What's their spiritual maturity level? These are all things that would go into your profile. What is their church relationship? And here, their church relationship could be that they are a motivated Christian, right? Young adult who wants to change the world. And then you've got unmotivated Christian young adult who doesn't want to change the world. They're unmotivated. And then you have the motivated non-Christian. And then you have the unmotivated Christian. And those are examples of potential breakdowns of a relationship question with regard to young adults and the church. These are questions you want to ask. What are they facing in culture? What are the biggest questions culture is asking right now? We know LGBTQ is a big question. We know that politics is growing increasingly important to a lot of younger people. Lots of cultural conversations are mattering, and understanding what those questions are and how to deal with them would be right there. What are their deepest fears? And then this is a big one. What do they want to fix in the world? Again, the scripture tells us to think about our brothers and sisters in Christ, and young adults are our brothers and sisters in Christ. As people, it says, think the best, right? We think the best of them. And to think the best is to say, hey, what they're doing, whether we agree with it or not, is trying to fix something. They want to make the world a better place. What do they think is in the way of making the world a better place? And try to understand what that is, and then bring it. Again, we want to bring the gospel to it. So context is important. Your generational context, your local church context, and your individual context are all important things as you begin to do this sort of discovery before you actually jump into the piece. Now, we all know that making disciples is a primary directive from Jesus. And good discipleship explores the context of those being discipled and brings spiritual application to their lives. We talked about this earlier. Paul did this with each of his letters, bringing along each church according to the spiritual and practical challenges they faced. Now, discipleship or making disciples is a term often used by ministries and ministry leaders. And the idea of discipleship can sometimes come across as more romantic than practical. I've had more than one conversation where I say, hey, define young adult ministry define discipleship, and they can't do it. Or they struggle with it. But if I were to ask them, hey, are you supposed to make disciples? They would. Sometimes we get caught up in the language, in the Christianese of it all, and we forget how to actually do these things. So though it is absolutely biblical, it is also often unclear what we mean when we say making disciples or discipleship. But discipleship is a core responsibility of your ministry. And it's important that you are both clear about what discipleship is and how you'll measure discipleship progress. So the connection here is that you got to understand your context, but you also have this directive to make disciples. And you really want to marry these two. You want to make sure that your discipleship efforts, and that needs to be clear, is going to intersect with the context that you're in. And so here is, and I'll do this briefly. And again, I would go into this way more in some of our longer trainings. But the way we see in our ministry, we define discipleship in these 4 categories. Now, your church probably has something similar to this, and it'd be a good idea to sit down with your church leader and come up with what discipleship is for you. But coming up with it is very, very important. But I can't go into deep detail about how integral, and this is integral to our ministry strategy and efforts. But I can say that this chart informed how we both defined and measured every aspect of our ministry. So we did it by heart, mind, soul, and strength. And quickly, the heart side of discipleship is the care and the empathy for people. You can read some of the words there. The mind stuff is the head, the theology, the doctrine, the teaching. The soul is the spiritual practices, worship, prayer, and fasting. And the strength is the service and the volunteering, mission, community service, giving, etc. And so all 4 of these things together, loving God and others in all 4 of these areas, for us, created a discipleship paradigm. And that paradigm, what it showed us was that individuals typically, like you and I, we typically kind of lean deeply into 1 or 2 of these. A couple of these come really easy. Like I'm a mind guy and I'm a soul guy, and I'm going to do those things. I'm going to gravitate to that kind of aspect. Those are the things that really, really excite me. It gets a little bit harder for me to do the heart and the strength stuff. And I have to be really intentional about those things. And I think most people are this way, that they have 1 or 2 of these that they really lean in, and the others they don't. But all of it is discipleship. We got to do all 4 of the pieces. And not only us, so that's me individually, I've got to do that in my life. We put that in front of our teams. We put that in front of our groups. We put that in front of our ministry that in ways that I'm going to describe to you later. This is a big deal. So figuring out if you can find a way to be clear about what discipleship is, it's going to help you create this strategy that you need going forward. So you need a clear understanding of what discipleship is, how to do it, and how to measure it while considering the context of those in your ministry. Okay, I know that that's a brief overview, and that went by probably very quickly. And this will be this will be available to you a little bit for a little while after this, and you'll be able to come back and look at that stuff a little bit more. Here, step number 2 is to create a playbook. So after you've gotten your context, now you got to create a plan of action, right? And so you need a plan. Most young adult ministries don't have a plan. There are so many young adult ministries running on sheer talent and gifting of the leader, apart from a winning strategy for long-term sustainable ministry. And they do get some success, and that success is almost counterproductive, in my opinion. But there are several reasons for this. Some leaders prefer spontaneity. Some of you are probably thinking already, I don't want to do all that. I just want to go. I just want to go, right? So some people don't like plans. They just want to do it. And others are looking for resources to help, and they can't find those resources. But whatever the reason, a ministry without a plan leads to one thing: burnout. And some of you may be burned out right now. Some of you are feeling the burnout coming on, and you can't burn at you. You're not going to be able to lead purely on your talents for a very long time without clear indicators of success and clear a picture of where you're going and how to get there. The average shelf life of a young adult pastor or ministry leader is about 2 years. And it's like clockwork. When I meet somebody over the years, we've met a lot of people in our neighborhood to young adult ministries. We try to connect the pastors together. And sure enough, man, I meet someone and 2 years later, they're no longer there. It's like 2 years is the number, I think. And so 2 years is the average time young adult ministry leaders last. And I think one of the biggest reasons, there's other really good reasons, right? Life changes. But one of the big reasons that is because those persons get burned out. They don't know how to measure success. They don't know if what they're doing is really mattering. And it's really, really hard to do ministry like that for a long time. And when the ministry leaves, when the leader leaves, the ministry typically dies. And then the church has to decide whether to try again. They've tried this a couple times, and many of the churches just decide, you know what, we've tried young adult ministry before, it didn't work, and so we're not going to try it again. Some of you may be dealing with that, and as a result of that, you have a smaller budget, or the expectations are significantly lower because they're like, man, we tried it, it didn't work. You can try something, but and it kind of produces this apathetic approach to young adult ministry, which is not helpful for anybody. And so we need a plan. So here's how this can get you started. We use an acronym called PAIRS, PAIRS. And unfortunately, it has absolutely nothing to do with young adult ministry at all. I couldn't think of anything. I did not have the creativity to come up with anything that really connected to young adult ministry. So you're just going to have to remember PAIRS. It just as a number, just as a word. It's not connected, but whatever. But this will get you started. PAIRS is a process to launching or growing your young adult ministry. So let's start with this. It's a 5-point starting point. And again, even though this is a starting point, if you've already started your young adult ministry, this is the practical side of getting started. These are some things that you can still do. In fact, there's going to be ups and downs in your young adult ministry anyway. Moments when you are humming and moments when you've got to inject some energy. And these are some really great ways to do that at any time. So here's what we do. We're going to do, again, a quick overview of this. Again, we would spend a ton of time on this whole process, but we're going to hit some highlights and give you some ideas. All right. So P, you start with prayer. The first P is prayer. And of course, everybody's like, well, of course you start with prayer, right? But listen, I mean this in a whole different way, not just one single prayer. As a person, for you personally, as the leader, I would like for you to commit to a 7-day prayer plan. And this is up to you. Listen, I say prayer plan, but really the plan is you're going to pray about young adults in the young adult ministry that you are creating or serving in. 7 days in a row, you're going to pray specifically and intentionally about young adult ministry and the young adults that you are ministering to or will minister to. I would also like to suggest that you commit to a 5-day fast, focusing on alignment with yourself and God's will for your ministry. Again, designed to get you and God on the same page about what the right next step is for your ministry, for wisdom, for clarity of vision, mission and vision, for all of that. So 7-day prayer, 5-day fast, just to get you started, right? It's the first step. Again, it's so much about getting ready. The second thing is to invite your church to pray with you. And I would suggest that you make your first gathering, if you're just getting started, or again, if you haven't gotten started yet, make your first gathering a prayer night, but invite everybody of all ages to come to it, but make it about young adults. Again, the prayer night is very specifically about young adult and young adult ministry. This looks like this. You go to your pastor, you say, Pastor, I would love to create a night where we could bring the church together, all who are willing to come and to pray about young adults. It's very simple. It could be low key, just a little bit of worship music and some prayer prompts to get it going. We're going to pray about young adults in our city. We're going to pray about the young adult leadership that's happening at this church and the focus that we're going to bring to that. And we're going to pray about the young adult leaders, right? And you just ask people to come and pray alongside you and create a little bit of a worship set with that. You can maybe enlist your worship guide to be a part of that. But it doesn't have to be big and fancy. In fact, it probably won't be, right? It's probably going to be how big your church is. It's probably going to be about 5 to 15 people who show up to this thing, right? Potentially, right? And it's totally okay if that's the case, right? But you want to make your first event a prayer night, and you want to make sure, you want to ask your pastor if you can do this church-wide invitation. What it does is it helps everybody in the church know that young adult ministry is important. It's important. It's the thing that we're doing. We're talking about that presence earlier. It's important to do that. Okay, I can't spend all that time on all of these, otherwise we're going to run out of time. So, and then after you do one of these, you want to plan a couple more of these, but more low key. You meet at a church, or you meet at your home, or at someone's home who's willing to host it, and you get a more intimate setting where you get to know the people who are in the room, who are willing to come to a night of prayer for young adults. And the reason that's important is because you need to connect with the persons in your church who have a heart for young adults. You need to find who they are, pull them up out of their spaces, and figure out who they are and make your connection, because they may be your first volunteers. So the key action steps, one of the key action steps in this area that you can take a note of today, is to do these prayer notes and pay attention to who shows up, and be sure to make lots of personal connections. Make sure that you make personal connections with these people. Make sure you get contact information, emails, so that you may reach out to them when the ministry starts to get moving, because these may be key volunteers and advocates for your ministry. The second thing you want to do, the A in pairs, is assessment. And this is an assessment is simply that you want to use what we call the ABC method, which is the asset-based community building method. And asset-based community just says, hey, what do I have around me? What are my assets, and how will I use them to create or better my community? And so in this particular scenario, you want to take a personal assessment, get very self-aware, say, what are your spiritual gifts and talents? What quadrant? And whenever you see D4 quadrant, I'm referring to that discipleship box that we talked about earlier, that heart, mind, soul, and strength that I described earlier. And so there's a lot of those in here because we use that a lot, but you can use whatever metric you use for your discipleship in a place of that when you see those. But which D4 quadrant do you gravitate towards, and what gives you energy, and other questions that you would ask yourself? You make a personal assessment. Who are you as a leader? What are the best things that you bring? If you do have volunteers, or you begin to get volunteers, then you want to discover and assess what spiritual gifts and talents they have, what quadrant they gravitate toward. You might consider a personality test, right? 16 personalities is a free test, and it's a Myers-Briggs test. And really what I found that does is often just gives you a springboard for conversation. Doesn't matter whether the test is right or wrong. What it does is it allows you to sit down with someone and say, hey, help me understand who you are. They can tell you who they are. They're like, oh, this is right and this is wrong. Doesn't matter how right or wrong it is. It's about understanding the persons that you're leading, right? And then you want to plan your first key volunteer meeting, right? This is something that you want to make sure you do in the assessment. You want to identify who they are and get that planned. And then after that, the key volunteers are going to meet up and do a kickoff icebreaker. Do 6 to 8 icebreaker kickoffs with your key volunteers. So the key volunteers you meet up with, eventually you're going to make these icebreaker events that I'll describe here in just a moment. And then the last thing you want to assess is the church. What assets are available to you? What, is it space? What space do you have? What rooms or sports arenas or classrooms, coffee shop, auditorium, outdoor? What assets are in your church that are available to you? You want to ask that. How much budget do you have? What is your church's reputation in the city? Is there something your church is known for that can be useful for drawing young adults into that space? And is there leadership who will walk alongside you? And what I mean by that is almost a side-by-side leader, someone who you would go to often and who would be closer than most when it comes to ministry. Key steps from here is to keep a log of your assets. Go ahead and write those things down. It'll be nice. It's a good idea to put them down on paper, and that way you can see. And when you get your team together, everyone can see, and it'll facilitate creativity for things going forward. And then you want to plan 6 to 8 icebreaker kickoff events. And what that means is, so if you think about that, you're by yourself as a leader. You draw in a few key leaders. It might be 1 person, 2 persons, 6 people, however many there are. You're not asking them to be on a team per se. You're not giving them any real roles. What you're just asking them to do is to help you create icebreaker kickoff events. And these events don't need to be Bible studies. In fact, I actually recommend that they're not Bible studies. The first thing you want to do, again, context is important. The first thing you want to do is get to know the young adults who are willing to come to something first and form a connection. So these things might just be really low-key, chill kind of things that allow you to connect and for them to connect to each other first. And so I would do 6 to 8 of these kickoff events that are low-key, don't have a whole lot of structure, sort of spiritual. It doesn't necessarily have to have the Bible study aspect. If 6 to 8 is too many, 4 to 6, but you want to create events and you want to lean into the giftings of your volunteers. So let's say you're a mind guy like I am, then I want to do Bible studies. But if you got a bunch of heart people in the room, they're like, hey, we want to go and we want to do this thing. Well, you really need your volunteers. You need your volunteers to be present at these events. You want them excited. You want them telling people. So lean into the giftings of your volunteers so that they're excited first, even at the sacrifice of yourself. Don't worry. You'll get a chance to do all that other stuff as we get going. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. But you want to focus on connection in the first 4 to 6 weeks or 6 to 8 weeks. And you want to get this stuff down on paper, write it down and get it scheduled. Okay, quickly, the I in pairs is invitation. So now that you've prayed up and you've assessed what you have and what tools are available to you, what people are there, and you've created some opportunity for people to get connected, you got to invite them to it. So the first thing you want to do is you and your core team are going to have some invitation goals. You create a personal invitation list, and these are with people who you and your team have high relational equity with. Also key is to acquire a church list of all young adults in the church. See if you can talk to the secretary and get a single list of all the young adults in your church. You want a list with names and numbers and email addresses there. And you also want to, if your church tracks this sort of thing, to acquire a list of young adult visitors from the last 6 months. Most churches have young adults come in and then they leave right away because there's not anything there to keep them. There's no sticky there. And so if you look at your visitor list, which I used to look at the church I was serving at, man, we had 45 at that time. We had 45% of the people that came into our church were young adults, and they just walked right back out. And our church was saying, hey, nobody comes out. We're not a college town. No young adults are here. I'm like 45% of the of the people who visited are young adults. right? So your number may not be that high, but you may be surprised at how many show up if you guys track that sort of thing. So get that list, the list of the churches who are the young adults who are members, and a list of visitors from the last 6 months. And then have a chat with your student pastor. If you're doing college ministry, have a chat with the student pastor and talk to him about who has graduated from the last year, last 2 years, and see if there's a log of that. And you want to make sure if they're not on the member list, then they may be someone that can reach out. And you may even ask him to reach out, him or her. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say him or her, to reach out and say, hey, there's this cool young adult ministry thing happening in the church, right? And they've got, since that student pastor may have a little more relational equity with those persons, see if you can maybe get them to send an email just to keep the party going. You'll want to send an email or connect with them as well, but that may be a good idea for you to do. Okay, then the second thing you're going to do in invitation is you're going to develop what I call invitation excursions. And this is simple. You're just going to brainstorm. We talked about earlier, where do young adults congregate? So this is where you're going to ask that question. What are the young adult events and locations in town where they kind of frequent? And so you and your team of leaders, your team of volunteers, are going to brainstorm ways to infiltrate those places and gatherings in town. And you want to do so with the idea that you want to invite those people into something, right? So it's just a moment of sitting down and saying, okay, where in our city are young adults? Where are the coffee shops, or where are the whatever they happen to be, and figure out that, and you want to brainstorm ways to go in there. Obviously, you want to make sure that your ministry ideas, especially at this point, is just all you need is a fingerprint, at least on the church website, a young adult ministry page, or whatever the answer is, where people can go and find you, connect with you, or be connected to those invitation events that you created earlier, those icebreaker events that we talked about in the last section. And of course, you want to begin to jump in on some social media stuff, but don't get too crazy about the social media stuff at this point. And the last thing you want to do is you want to figure out what invitation looks like through your church. So that might be a physical location. Sometimes you can set up a booth somewhere. Some churches don't do booths. A section in the sanctuary may be a place where if you have other young adults, you're like, hey, we're always going to sit over here. And that could help create some synergy and presence on a Sunday morning. Of course, Sunday school, if you have that kind of thing. But also this is almost a hack. Infiltrate the greeting team and the new members class process. Make sure that you, especially when you're first getting started, that you are on the greeting team. And I would say officially or unofficially. Like I at the church we were at, I wasn't on the team, like in the sense that I showed up to their meetings and all, but I just put myself in. I was at the door. I just stood by the door. And I stood by the door, with the express intention of, as soon as I saw a young adult person walk in, I wanted to make sure that I met them. The goal is that you meet the new guests that show up. And so you make a facial, you make the first impression, and you get right in on that if you can. And so infiltrate that greeting team. And then the new members class is also, if depending on how loose that is, if you can find a way to get young adult ministry get into that, and those persons who are new to the church, you want to meet them. A lot of parents show up without their young adult children because they don't think there's anything there for their young adults. So in a new members class, when you say, hey, I'm the young adults guy, a lot of parents will be like, oh, really? Wow, I didn't know we had that. I have John or Judy at home. I'll have to tell them about that. And those are opportunities. So infiltrate the greeting team, infiltrate the new members class. Okay, so here's what you want to do, action steps for here. One, you want to make sure you schedule on your calendar visiting locations where young adults gather. And if you as the leader, I would recommend, if you can do this, and again, not everybody's time schedule works for this, but go there often. Example, if there's a coffee shop that everyone goes to, frequent it enough that you're on first name basis with the people that work there and that they know you, right? And become a consistent presence in those spaces. And then the other action is join the greeting team if possible, even unofficially in the way that I described, and make sure you personally connect with all young adult visitors. Okay. Again, these are some ideas that we can go. There's more to go into, but these get you started. Okay, rhythm. Okay, so after you've got the invitation, now you want to establish rhythm. So internal communication, right? You want to create. Now that you've got some people who are coming, and you want to be able to sort of keep the momentum going by making sure that everyone's communicated with easily. So you should choose 2 group communication platforms. One of those platforms should be something one way, almost like an email. Email could be one of those things. And then the other one would be something like a group text or something like that. But you want to find, whether it's a Facebook group, whatever it is, you want to find 2 group communication platforms that you're going to use. One that's really, really broad and one that allows for some back and forth. And then you want to begin to think about establishing rhythmic communication about upcoming events and the things that are going on, or where you're going to be sitting on Sunday, or if you're going out to lunch after, whatever it is you're doing, you create some rhythmic communication so that they get used to seeing that something's always happening. Then you want to guest follow up, right? Make sure that you create a rhythm for following up with guests that come to your events. Again, at this point, those events are kind of the fun events. And so they're probably a little more organic, but you want to make sure that you have a clear way to seize the moment and meet those guests and follow up with those guests. And this might include a volunteer or getting some software. And you can look through. I have some ideas about that, but again, we can't get into it right now. Determine the discipleship strategy. So this is what we said before. This is the point in the process where you really want to start thinking about discipleship. Okay, so you've got people here, you've connected to the people, and now you've got a general sense, if you will, of where they are and what they might need, using a profile that we're talking about and that context we were talking about. And so now you really, really want to double down on, okay, what is our discipleship strategy? We've defined what discipleship was earlier, but what is the strategy? How are we going to put the elements into place? To give you an example, for the D4 quadrants, right, the heart, mind, soul, and strength, you would ask yourself, okay, what are going to be some heart events or heart-focused initiatives? What are going to be some mind-focused initiative? What are going to be some soul-focused initiative and strength-focused initiative? And you want to start thinking about the ministry in those contexts, right? Start brainstorming. You're not putting anything into stone quite yet, but you're brainstorming it, right? And you're trying to get that down, and you want to challenge yourself to think in those ways. And then, what discipleship formats will you major on first, right? Is this going to be a one-to-one, meaning you to the one here is the first one is the young adult person that you're ministering to. So are they going to be one to you, one to few? That should say one to many. Apologies, it says one to man, but one to many and one to one. And the big one is the church. So are you going to try to do single, connect with each person one-on-one? And that may work if you have a smaller group. Is it one to few, like groups, like small groups? You want to think about putting things in groups? Is it one to many, like a bigger group, like a worship gathering that you're going to begin to do, and that person's going to be a part of a larger gathering? And then what are going to be the ways? Is it just going to be to connect these people into the life of the church, right? These are some options for you to think through. What are the discipleship formats? And then the last thing is you want to develop a draft. After you've thought through those things, you want to develop a draft annual calendar. So you want to set the first 90 days in stone, get it in, and then write the next 9 months in hard pencil. Use your discipleship framework to determine those activities. Again, you want to look at your calendar and say, are we providing opportunity for discipleship in each one of those quadrants, if you will? If you're using the heart, mind, soul, strength metric, then that's what you do. Again, you can use whatever metric you want to use, but whatever you use, you want to make sure that it is reflected in your calendar. And you want to make sure you factor in church calendar, the things going on at your church, and that you don't overlap that. The college calendar, if you're dealing with college students, holidays, and then you want to also factor in young adult energy shifts, which I don't have time to talk about at the moment. So, but but you want to factor those things in. Okay. And so the big key step coming out of Rhythm is develop your annual calendar. And then build momentum through celebration. Make sure that as you're moving things through and as people are growing and connecting, that you celebrate milestones and you celebrate people. Make sure you're celebrating your volunteers, your key volunteers, and all of that. Okay, the last part of this we're going to fly through. And I know you guys probably have to go. We're at 12:30. Okay. So we're going to try to fly through this and get done. But the last part of structure really just a couple more slides. You want to develop structure. So after all of that is when you start talking about structure. Now, it's important to understand that you don't have to start with structure. You start with connection. You start with context, and then you work your way to structure, right? You work your way to structure. You start with context, start with connection, work your way to structure. And so once you get to this point, now you want to start to put the mission and vision, solidify it, and you want to do this together. You want to dream together. So what we used to do is we had a mission and vision that we would have at the start of it, but we would gather young adults into our spaces, and then we would ask them, hey, where do you guys want to see this ministry go? And we would really open up the room to allow them to dream with us and really weigh in on the deal. In fact, we would take a whole week, we would take a gathering time that we would have, and we did this throughout, right? So this wasn't just at the beginning of our ministry. We did this repeatedly. Hey, where do you guys see this ministry going, right? We did this over and over again, even when we revisited what our mission and vision. And we asked them to weigh in. We would take a week to do that, and we would say, okay, we would discuss it. And 7 days after this, or the next time we meet up, we're going to tell you where we're going to go, whether that's you or whether you have a team that's doing that. If you're first getting started, then it's probably just going to be you, but you're going to get everyone dreaming together. Then after you've got everyone dreaming together and you coming up with what it is that you guys want to do, the mission statement or the vision that comes out of that conversation, you're going to come back and you're going to affirm that vision. You're going to say, this is who we are. This is what we do. This is where we're going. And you're going to make sure that everyone who was a part of that conversation knows that they are key to achieving that vision. So you want to get that weigh in early, and then you want to try to get that buy-in right at the end. You want to say, listen, man, we need you. If we're going to do this and we think this is cool, then we need people like you. This is y'all's idea. Y'all played into this, and you want to get that going. So one of the reasons you do structure later is you want to get people a part of what you're building and get them to weigh in and be a part of that building process. After that, you want to develop roles and teams. And so brainstorm what roles you might need. And again, this may not be killer elaborate, right? But just sit down and think through, hey, what do we really need? Do I need a social media? Like, what do we need? And then start to draft role descriptions. And these could be just things that sit in a folder for the moment. But what writing the draft description would do, it'll clarify structure for you from a people volunteer point of view, but it will also help you know what you're looking for when you meet them. You're like, man, I'm looking for an administrator. Okay, when you're meeting people at the door, or you've met people at your meetings, and you're listening to people and they're talking a certain way, and you hear, you know what, they seem like a person who's excited about doing administration. They love Excel, right? Then you know, okay, man, I have a need for that. And now you can invite them into your need with a clear, this is what this role would look like kind of thing, right? So not only helps you get people there, but it helps you train your eyes to know what you're looking for. And that's a way of bringing empowerment and arm wrapping people into leadership, especially early on. And after you develop your roles, you want to develop plans. You want to use that discipleship strategy to set targets. And again, this is like goals. So you say, hey, we want to, in the strength quadrant, we want to make sure that we're serving X amount of times per month or per quarter. Right. Or when we teach, we want to make sure that we get have X amount of opportunities for someone new to come up and teach. So we know that we're some way to measure some target that you would set that measures the progress of your discipleship. And again, this could be done in concert with your leadership team, or this could be your leadership team in your church, or just could be you. And then you can dream. What should the church look like after year 1? What should it look like after year 3? And you start thinking about that, right? Because again, you want to have the short-term picture of 90 days that we talked about in the last section, but you also want to have this big picture of 1 year and 3 year, because it begins to give people something to get excited about. If they're like me, I'm a person who, you get my best work when I know when I have a big picture. You get my worst work when I don't have a big picture. Right. But if you give me a big picture, then that helps me know that what I'm doing matters towards something larger. And that actually helps me stick and stay to the ministry. And then the last thing you want to do, we said, write the calendar in hard pencil. You want to solidify the calendar and make sure that you add all team meetings. Make sure you think about appreciation events for your volunteers. And make sure you want to get that to where it's as out of the draft status and into the official status. And the last two things in structure, again, we could do a whole session on structure alone. So we're just really hitting the tip of the iceberg here. You want to do leadership and volunteer development, create on and off ramps for your volunteers. And you want to, on those on and off ramps, 3 principles that you want to do when you're developing leaders. You, as the leader of leaders, need to support young adult leaders, resource young adult leaders, and appreciate young adult leaders. Those are your directives. What do they need from you for success? Or how do you set them up for success mentally, spiritually, etc.? What tools do they need to succeed? And how can you express consistent gratitude? These 3 things will help your leaders feel supported and that you're walking with them, that you see them, and it creates a longer tenure of service and less burnout, which burnout is the big destroyer of young adult ministries. And then lastly, how do you measure progress? And again, we talked about this earlier. Voice, presence, and opportunity. You want to be able to ask yourself, how well do we listen as a community, as a ministry? How well do we measure our visibility? How do we measure visibility and connection to the church at large? How well do we empower passions and gifts? These are some of your metrics. Another metric would be, how are we going to measure discipleship, which is kind of what we talked about earlier, right? But these are the things that you begin to put structure around. You begin to put structure around. For instance, you're like, man, you haven't talked about modes and models. Again, there's so much that we haven't hit yet. But when you answer the question about discipleship, the D4 quadrant, that's where you're going to get, whether you're a small group person, whether you're going to do large groups, whether you're going to do a worship team, a worship experience, you're going to do it once a month, or you're going to do it suddenly the combination of your context and the discipleship metrics will begin to help you form your calendar and figure out what it is you need to do. And there are tons of models to use. Okay, so that is it's over an hour, but that is the quick overview of a process that hopefully has been helpful to you as we move forward. There's a few things I want to tell you about before we get to some Q&A, and if you got to go, then you have to go. But some ministry tools and resources coming soon on our website. We're going to be bringing you a series of resources, a full resource library at elevateministry.net. And this is where we're going to have software suggestions for practical as well as spiritual things, young adult ministry media, the books and podcasts that maybe you can use and go and find for your research, surveys, templates, other ministry programs like ours that are going to, like webinars and online courses and things. There's a few of those around, and so much more. We really want Elevate to be a single source for young adult ministry resources for people like you. So we want to make sure you get that. So stay tuned because that'll be coming. Hopefully a first version of that will be ready before the year is done. But we have quite a bit of things that we have in the fire that we're doing. The next thing we're going to be creating is a peer support network. And so if you're looking to be able to connect with other young adult pastors and ministers, then that's in the works as well. The best way to stay on top of that is to go to our Facebook page, and you can find that. The easiest way to find that is we made a shortcut for it using elevateministry.net/Facebook. You go, you like the page, and when the group becomes available, we'll announce it on the page, and you'll have the chance to get a part of that when it becomes publicly available. Also, we're going to be making dozens of resource videos. So we've got over 40 videos that we're going to be making by the end of the year that will be specifically about young adult ministry. And so that's another way for you to connect directly. That one's free, of course. YouTube is free. And so those are going to be things that we'd love to be able to connect with you through it. And we haven't started creating them. We haven't started creating them fully. But they will be there. There'll be 40 of those before the year is done. So YouTube is a way to get to that is elevateministry.net/YouTube. And the last thing I want to talk to you about before we get to Q&A is this very important thing that we're doing. So as I've intimated to you that, man, we hit the tip of the iceberg today and really kind of top level on some of this, but we have a 5-week course on young adult ministry. We call it our young adult ministry primer. And the big goal out of it is that you will come out with a custom playbook for your young adult ministry. A lot of things that we talked about today are in that primer, but we go into way more detail. There's 5 sessions, about 90 minutes each, that would go on. And one starts next week on September the 13th at 1 p.m. There is a cost associated with the primer, but this is our first release of the primer. And so as founding members, you would get a significant discount to be a part of this first launch. But man, we really think this would be really, really helpful, and it will allow us to walk a little bit more closely with you in your young adult ministry journey. A couple things that come a part of the primer: you get the classes, but you also get a peer network. Again, that peer network of young adult ministers a part of that. There's also 2 monthly coaching calls for Q&A for leaders. And I'll be a part of helping facilitate. I'll be facilitating, answering those Q&As. And then you'll get access to the growing resource library and lifetime access to every version of this primer as we continue to build on it going forward. So lifetime access to peer network, lifetime access to coaching calls happening at least twice a month. And the 5-week course that are about 90 minutes each, designed to give you a physical playbook that you can print out and be able to take to your church leadership or to your team to say, hey, here is a clear plan for us going forward. Starting September 13th, the primer is good for you if you are launching a young adult ministry from scratch, if you're looking to take your young adult ministry to the next level, everything we said before. But also, if you're looking to encourage and be encouraged by peers, it's a great option for you. And if you're willing to invest time and energy to maximize your young adult ministry footprint, then this is a big thing for you. It's something that I think will be really helpful. And I can't wait. I can't wait to deliver it and to give it to you and to make it happen. So that is a good fit for you. If that's where you are, if you're just getting started, you're looking for a way to go, you're looking for someone to help you go forward, then you want to get to the primer. Do you want in? If it sounds like you, then let's schedule a quick call to see if you're a good fit for the program. Not everyone is a good fit. So we are learning to, some people are not a good fit for the program. So yes. So we want to plan a quick little 15, 20-minute call with the intention to understand the ministry and if we're a good fit to helping you grow. You can set up that phone call you can email us at hello@elevateministry.net, or you can use this, you can use the link elevateministry.net/primer to get to the link where you can schedule the event. And I'm going to put the elevateministry.net in our little chat here. And what that will do is it'll take you to a Calendly, basically a place where you can schedule for yourself a calendar, a time that will fit well for you, so we can have that phone call. There's only 8 spots. We keep the classes very small, so there's only 8 spots left in this particular one that's coming up, and I'd love for you to be a part of it. Okay,